At the G20 summit in Johannesburg, a seemingly harmless detail unexpectedly triggered a diplomatic earthquake. The United States sent only a low-level embassy official to receive the ceremonial gavel from President Cyril Ramaphosa, an action widely viewed as disregarding protocol and disrespecting the host nation. But the real shock came immediately afterward. For the first time, the European Union stepped forward with a forceful response, openly criticizing Washington's lack of respect. And Ibrahim Traoré instantly backed that stance, forming a completely new axis between Europe and Africa. The answers are in the next part. Hit like and stay with me as we uncover the full story. The moment the ceremony ended in Johannesburg, analysts across Africa and Europe immediately understood that something was wrong. The G20 is built on choreography symbols, rank, protocol, and gestures that quietly communicate hierarchy and respect. When any link in that chain is broken, especially by a global power like the United States, the consequences ripple far beyond the room. At the center of the event was the gavel, simple in appearance, yet loaded with diplomatic weight. It represents continuity of global governance, cooperation between nations, and the integrity of the institutions managing global crises. That is why President Cyril Ramaphosa personally handed it over. For South Africa, hosting the G20 had been more than a rotating duty. It had become a demonstration of legitimacy at a moment when Pretoria was challenging the world's most powerful countries in venues like the International Court of Justice. Which is why the American decision to send a lower-ranking embassy official struck so deeply. South Africa had just spent months defending its position on the world stage legally, diplomatically, and morally. Yet the handover ceremony signaled something very different, a downgrade. Not a clerical error, not a miscommunication, but a symbolic statement. Across Pretoria's political and diplomatic circles, the interpretation was unanimous. This was not an accident. In African diplomacy, where history is long and memories are longer, a perceived slight is not simply brushed off. It resurfaces wounds of centuries spent under foreign control, foreign judgment, and foreign narratives. If South Africa receives this treatment, one analyst remarked, what chance does any other African nation have? The ceremony became the quiet spark that lit a much larger fire. Within days, the atmosphere intensified. Washington's domestic politics were accelerating into campaign mode, and former President Donald Trump seized the moment in a way that stunned even veteran diplomats. During a rally, he declared that South Africa would be barred from attending the upcoming G20 summit in Miami. His justification rested on a claim widely debunked by human rights groups, international monitors, and even U.S. intelligence agencies, the narrative of a so-called white genocide in South Africa. For Pretoria, this was beyond offensive, it was destabilizing. South Africa's presidency issued a rapid response, presenting official crime data, investigative reports, and academic research to debunk the genocide narrative. They accused Trump of using misinformation as a political tool and warned that such rhetoric threatened not only bilateral relations, but the stability of multilateral institutions themselves. And then, something unusual happened. Europe stepped in. Germany called the idea of expelling South Africa illegitimate and dangerous, warning that no single member could decide the fate of another. The European Commission stated bluntly that the G20 was a platform for crisis management, not a vehicle for U.S. political theater. France reminded the world that without South Africa, the G20 could no longer claim to represent global realities. Africa would be erased from the table. Major economies outside the West issued their own warnings. India, Indonesia, and Brazil signaled through diplomatic channels that they would formally oppose any attempt to exclude South Africa. One Asian diplomat described Trump's threat as a nuclear institutional weapon, a move that could shatter the G20 if ever carried out. Behind all of this sat one critical fact. The United States had no legal authority to remove South Africa. The G20 operates on consensus. Every member must agree for such a decision to stand. And in this case, not only would consensus be impossible, there was overwhelming resistance. So Trump's declaration became less about legality and more about shaping public perception. It was a message to his supporters, a narrative designed for applause. But on the world stage, It provoked a backlash that revealed deep fractures in the global order. And as tensions escalated, a new, unexpected voice would soon emerge, one that few in Washington anticipated, yet one that resonated powerfully across Africa. But that was only the beginning, because what happened next would reshape alliances in ways no one predicted. What came next elevated a diplomatic irritation into a global confrontation. When Donald Trump took the stage at his rally, he spoke with the full theatrical force that has always energized his base. Before thousands of supporters, he announced that South Africa would be banned from the G20 summit in Miami. He cited a narrative that had already been dismissed by human rights organizations, U.S. intelligence reviews, and independent international observers. The claim that South Africa was committing a white genocide. Those in the crowd erupted, but in capitals across the world, alarms began ringing. For Pretoria, the statement was more than misinformation, it was an existential threat. South Africa is not only the sole African member of the G20, it is a nation carrying the weight of an entire continent on its shoulders. To be removed would mean Africa being erased from one of the world's most influential tables. The response from the South African presidency was immediate and fierce. Officials presented verified crime statistics, academic research, and investigations, proving that no organized campaign of racial extermination existed. They accused Trump of deploying a toxic narrative for political gain, one that distorted South Africa's reality and weaponized racial fear. Yet the backlash did not stop at South Africa's borders. Europe reacted with an intensity that surprised even seasoned diplomats. Germany, a founding pillar of the global economic architecture, warned that the G20's legitimacy would collapse if any member were removed based on unilateral political claims. The European Commission went further, publicly stating that the forum is not an arena for domestic U.S. political battles. France added moral weight, arguing that excluding South Africa would undermine the G20's claim to global inclusivity. And still, the momentum grew. From New Delhi, Jakarta, and Brasilia came signals of resistance. Diplomatic channels leaked reports of countries preparing to lodge formal objections should Washington attempt to make its threat real. One Asian ambassador was quoted saying that Trump's proposal was the institutional equivalent of using a nuclear weapon, a move so destructive that it could collapse the G20 entirely. All of this unfolded as Africa's internal political landscape was shifting. The continent's younger leaders, particularly those in the Sahel, had become more assertive, rejecting old patterns of deference to world powers. Among them was Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, a rising figure whose speeches had already made waves across African news outlets. At first, it was unclear how leaders like Traoré would respond to the crisis, but privately, African diplomats worried that the attack on South Africa would set a dangerous precedent. If the United States could justify removing one African country by citing misinformation, what would stop it from targeting others in the future? And then, the turning point arrived. Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward with a public statement that echoed across Africa and into Europe. Though young, though often portrayed as a disruptor, his message was measured, sharp, and grounded in principle. He declared that no nation, no matter how powerful, had the right to use false narratives to expel an African country from global institutions. His words resonated. They carried something that Europe's statements lacked: the moral clarity of a continent that had endured centuries of outside interference. Traoré warned that if South Africa could be targeted today, Burkina Faso or any other African nation could be targeted tomorrow. And suddenly, he became the symbolic voice of the global South. Across African capitals Bamako, Niamey, Ouagadougou, his stance was praised as bold, necessary, even historic. African news channels replayed his remarks repeatedly, framing them as a defining moment in the continent's fight for dignity. The crisis now had two fronts: Washington versus Pretoria, and a second battle between a fading unipolar model and a rising chorus of nations demanding respect, accountability, and equality. And at the center of that chorus stood a young African leader few in the West had ever expected to see aligned, however briefly, with the European Union. But the deeper consequences were still unfolding, and they would soon reach into the economic lifeblood of South Africa itself. As the political storm intensified, the consequences for South Africa extended far beyond diplomatic indignation. At home, the nation found itself confronting a harsh and immediate reality. Without G20 participation, its economic stability could suffer in ways that reached deep into families, factories, and farms. The United States remains one of South Africa's most important economic partners. Through the African Growth and Opportunity Act, known as AGOA, South Africa exports automobiles, citrus, wine, and manufactured goods to the American market under preferential terms. Tens of thousands of jobs depend directly on this access. A rupture with Washington could jeopardize those livelihoods overnight. Economists in Pretoria began modeling worst-case scenarios. What happens if US policymakers decide to retaliate with sanctions? What happens if AGOA benefits are suspended? For a middle-income country already fighting unemployment, inflation, and post-pandemic strain, the answers were alarming. In Parliament, the debate grew heated. One faction warned that South Africa could not afford to alienate the United States, especially when global capital markets were already jittery. They argued that national pride must be balanced against survival. Another faction countered that the country had a responsibility, both moral and strategic, to stand firm in its legal challenge at the International Court of Justice. They insisted that national dignity could not be traded for economic convenience. And then, as the divide widened, Africa itself began to reshape the conversation. Across the Sahel, leaders who had grown increasingly skeptical of Western influence followed the crisis closely. Among them, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso became a central figure. His stance was not merely symbolic, it reshaped how South Africans viewed their own struggle. Burkina Faso had no direct stake in AGOA or the G20, yet Traoré's message hit a nerve. Africa must not allow its future to be decided by narratives crafted abroad. The moment his words circulated across African news platforms, they took on a life of their own. His defense of South Africa was interpreted not as flattery, but as recognition that Pretoria's fight was, in reality, the continent's fight. For many ordinary South Africans, especially younger citizens, Traoré represented something they rarely saw: a leader from another African nation standing up unequivocally for their country on the international stage. In talk shows, radio segments, and street interviews, people expressed a renewed sense of continental unity. If Burkina Faso can stand with us, why shouldn't we stand with ourselves? This unexpected solidarity softened political pressure inside Pretoria. Officials who once leaned toward compromise began to adopt firmer language. They argued that bending to US threats would set a precedent that endangered not only South Africa, but also nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, countries that had recently pushed back against external dominance. Economists observed a second consequence. The crisis accelerated discussions on diversifying trade away from US dependency. Talks about strengthening partnerships with Brazil, India, and Indonesia gained traction. European support made diversification seem more realistic, especially as the European Union publicly aligned with South Africa against unilateral pressure. Still, anxiety persisted. Factories wondered whether export orders would be cancelled. Wine growers feared losing access to the American market. Small businesses braced themselves for a downturn should tariffs rise. It was a moment when diplomacy and daily life collided, when political rhetoric in Washington threatened real consequences for workers in Port Elizabeth, farmers in Limpopo, and miners in Mpumalanga. Yet something else was happening in the background, a larger shift, one involving identity, dignity, and Africa's place in the world, was beginning to overshadow the economic fear. Traoré's words had reframed the crisis from a bilateral dispute into a continental test, and gradually, attention began to shift once again from economics to geopolitics, from markets to power, from fear to resolve. Because the next development would not just involve South Africa's economy, it would challenge Washington's strategic position on the world stage, exposing a vulnerability few Americans had considered. And that vulnerability becomes clear only when we look at how the United States responded, and how the rest of the world interpreted the showdown. Inside Washington, the reaction to the crisis was far from unified. Some policymakers viewed Trump's declaration as a campaign performance rather than a foreign policy blueprint. Others feared that, intentional or not, his words had created real diplomatic liabilities for the United States. What startled many in the strategic community was not South Africa's response, nor even Europe's pushback, but the emergence of a new political force inside Africa that Washington had underestimated. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. For decades, U.S. engagement with Africa followed a predictable script: aid, military cooperation, counter-terrorism agreements, and carefully scripted diplomatic visits. Washington operated under the assumption that African nations would rarely challenge U.S. influence openly. But the continent had changed. The Sahel had changed. Burkina Faso had changed. And the rise of younger leaders willing to defy both Washington and Paris disrupted long-held assumptions. Traoré's statement defending South Africa reverberated through policy circles in D.C. Here was a leader from a smaller nation, one that American officials typically considered peripheral to global economics, publicly confronting the United States on principle and being applauded across African news platforms for doing so. His words made something clear. Africa was no longer content to be treated as a secondary actor in global decision-making. Meanwhile, Europe found itself in a rare position, aligned with an African voice against a U.S. political figure. EU officials acknowledged privately that Traoré's intervention strengthened their argument. It demonstrated that defending South Africa was not simply a matter of European diplomacy, but a broader issue of institutional fairness. For Germany and France, his comments provided unexpected moral cover. They could say, "We and Africa stand on the same side," a sentence seldom heard in international geopolitics. Beyond the West, the reaction was even more revealing. In Asia, policymakers viewed the situation through the lens of global governance. India, Indonesia, and Malaysia saw Trump's threat as deeply destabilizing. If powerful countries could remove inconvenient members from multilateral institutions, what would stop them from targeting Asian nations next? Traoré's stance was praised in several regional editorials, an African leader speaking out not only for Africa, but for all nations vulnerable to unilateral pressure. In Latin America, the crisis triggered old memories. Brazilian and Argentine commentators drew parallels to historical U.S. interventions in their region. Many expressed admiration for South Africa's defiance and for Burkina Faso's vocal support. Analysts argued that the world had entered a new era, one in which global South leaders increasingly shape the narrative rather than receiving it. In BRICS and BRICS capitals, the reaction was predictable but still significant. Russia and China amplified the controversy as evidence that the U.S.-led order was fracturing. They highlighted Traoré's remarks frequently, framing him as a symbol of a rising multipolar world. African news outlets echoed this sentiment, noting how Burkina Faso had transitioned from domestic turbulence to global influence faster than anyone expected. But while other countries saw opportunity, the United States saw vulnerability. The crisis forced Washington to confront a difficult question: how much influence does America still command in a world where even smaller nations feel empowered to challenge it? For officials at the Pentagon, the State Department, and the National Security Council, the situation was troubling. Losing goodwill in Africa did not simply threaten symbolic relationships, it risked undermining counter-terrorism operations, economic partnerships, and access to strategic minerals. Moreover, U.S. policymakers admitted something quietly. Europe siding with an African leader, especially one as assertive as Ibrahim Traoré, was diplomatically awkward for Washington. The entire narrative weakened America's claim to moral authority, a pillar of U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And so, the crisis at the G20 had evolved into something much larger, a stress test of American global influence, a challenge to Western unity, and a demonstration of Africa's new, confident posture on the world stage. But the most surprising development was still ahead, a twist involving alliances, power, and a dramatic shift in global legitimacy, one that would reshape how both Africa and the West understood the future. Because the next revelation would redefine who truly holds power in this era of global uncertainty. What happened next stunned observers across every major capital. Just when it seemed the confrontation would spiral beyond repair, the global narrative shifted suddenly, dramatically, and in a direction few in Washington had anticipated. The twist began in Brussels. European officials, already critical of the United States' unilateral rhetoric, recognized that they were not standing alone. For the first time, An African leader, one not traditionally aligned with Western institutions, had taken a public position that aligned directly with the European Union's defense of multilateral order. That leader was Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. At first, analysts assumed the alignment was coincidental. After all, Traoré had built his reputation on rejecting Western pressure, not supporting it. But the deeper truth soon became clear. Traoré was not supporting Europe. He was forcing Europe to honor the very rules it claimed to uphold. This subtle but powerful distinction changed everything. European newspapers began running headlines. EU and Africa united against unilateralism. Africa's new voices reshape global governance. Burkina Faso leader challenges US narrative. Africa news platforms amplified the momentum. Clips of Traoré's speech circulated with millions of views, painting him not only as a national figure, but as a global symbol of equality and sovereign dignity. Commentators in Ouagadougou and Johannesburg said openly what many had whispered for decades. Africa is no longer the audience of world politics. It is a co-author. For Europe, this unexpected alignment was politically advantageous. They could now argue that defending South Africa was not anti-American, it was pro-multilateralism, pro-law, and pro-legitimacy. Traoré's stance shielded them from the usual accusations of strategic opportunism. Germany and France emphasized that they were following principles, not politics. The irony was unmistakable. A leader from Burkina Faso had given Europe the moral confidence to stand firm. Meanwhile, Washington found itself increasingly isolated. Even officials who privately sympathized with Trump's worldview admitted that the optics were terrible. The United States appeared to be using discredited narratives as political weapons, while a young African president, often portrayed as radical, appeared to be the one defending international law and institutional integrity. This reversal of roles shook Washington's political establishment. The U.S. had always defined itself as the guardian of global norms. But now, across talk shows and editorials, commentators observed something unprecedented. The West was divided, and Africa, led symbolically by voices like Traoré, was influencing the narrative. Behind closed doors, EU diplomats warned the White House that they would not participate in a G20 summit that excluded South Africa. India and Brazil echoed the same message. Indonesia and Saudi Arabia signaled that they shared the concern. The possibility of a fractured G20, a collapse of one of the world's most important institutions, became real, and suddenly, the threat to ban South Africa evaporated. It was never formally withdrawn, but in diplomatic language, the silence spoke loudly. Preparations for Miami moved forward, with South Africa included. The global coalition had prevailed not because of military strength, not because of economic leverage, but because the narrative itself had shifted. And at the heart of that shift was the symbolic presence of Ibrahim Traoré. A leader from Burkina Faso, one of the poorest countries in the world, had influenced a debate involving the richest nations on earth. Without commanding armies, without commanding wealth, simply with a clear principle: no nation should be expelled from global institutions based on falsehoods. This moment marked a turning point. Africa was no longer merely reacting to global events, it was initiating them. Europe, usually divided between interests and ideals, had been forced into coherence. And the United States, long accustomed to defining the rules, discovered that it could no longer do so unchallenged. It was a quiet revolution, but a revolution nonetheless. And when the dust settled, one question remained: what does this new alignment mean for the future of global leadership? When the crisis finally eased, the world was left with a lesson far larger than the dispute that started it. What happened between Johannesburg and Miami became more than a diplomatic clash. It became a revelation about the future of global leadership. South Africa refused to bow. Europe rediscovered its commitment to multilateral principles, and a young leader from Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, proved that moral clarity could carry as much weight as any economic or military power. For Africa, it was a moment of rebirth. The continent had long been treated as a supporting character in a story written elsewhere, but in this confrontation, Africa stood firm, not with violence, not with threats, but with dignity. It showed that the global South is not merely reacting to the world, it is shaping it. African news commentators captured the sentiment perfectly. A new chapter has begun. South Africa protected its seat at the global table. Europe defended the legitimacy of institutions it helped build, and Ibrahim Traoré reminded the world of something essential. Chongtoi Hongshin Fep de Duk Tudu, Chongtoi Dadung Len de Jianlino. The story does not end here. Miami is not the final test, it is the beginning of a new era, an era in which Africa demands respect, asserts its sovereignty, and refuses to be defined by narratives written outside its borders. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. If you believe Africa deserves a voice equal to any other, subscribe to this channel, stay with us, and continue walking this journey toward a world where no nation must bow its head to be heard. God bless Africa.